Hello and welcome back into the Reading Corner. I am excited to be back after a couple months off from making videos, and I'm hoping that you guys are excited to be back with me as well. Today we are going to be looking at Noam Chomsky's 1992 book, What Uncle Sam Really Wants. I'll be going over some key ideas as well as later getting into my personal review of the book. Chomsky starts his history following World War II with the existence of central planners in the State Department who all agree upon the idea that the US should maintain its dominant position in the world following World War II. And essentially, the first step of this plan is partnership with and rebuilding of other Western countries. And in that partnership, Chomsky says that they rebuilt the countries in a certain way that they would have some control over those politics and that the people in those countries in the working class would not get too much power. And well, outwardly, the US may have tried to appear to support democracy. Chomsky says that they actively suppressed democracy. And they were mostly scared of the uprising of third world countries, according to Chomsky, and these ultra nationalist regimes. And to Chomsky, these ultra nationalist regimes would essentially give the people power to control the wealth of their labor. And the US business interests and the US State Department were not for that. So essentially, the US would try to keep a handle on the government and leadership in third world countries. And when it couldn't do so through peaceful means, it would eventually step in and overthrow elections through coups or through rigging the elections or military force, different ways of suppressing democracy. He lists several examples of this: Iran, Guatemala, the Dominican Republic, Chile, Brazil, and goes into more detail on these examples. Chomsky talks about how even in countries where the US and businesses here don't have huge investment interests, we still try to keep those countries under control. And the reason for that, he says, is the threat of a good example. We invaded Grenada in 1983, overthrew democracy in Laos in 1960. He cites these as examples of smaller countries where there weren't as many investment interests, but the US was scared of this threat of a good example, which means that if a smaller country can do it, then a bigger country thinks, well, why can't we also rise up and control our own destiny? Wildly enough, the US has intervened in every single Central American country that I know of, plus Chile, Brazil as well. These interventions can sometimes be quite brutal, such as the case of the killing of 6 Jesuit priests in El Salvador by a battalion that was El Salvadorian but trained by the United States, and it had happened just after the training. So a little sketchy on that end. And then also the invasion of Panama, for instance, with hundreds of people killed reportedly, and this was done by the US. He talks about how the media ignored human rights abuses by dictators that the US propped up for years, decades, before if the dictator had started to step out of line or the president of the country had started to disagree with the US on some things or it started to implement some policies that the US didn't like, then the media would suddenly turn on these people and begin to report negatively about them when they've been ignoring very bad stuff for years. And so there's kind of a double standard amongst the media that we're familiar with in today's day and age that Chomsky is talking about here. Next, Chomsky talks about Vietnam and talks about it in a similar light as the Central American interventions. Obviously, this one was a much more well known, widely spread news story, also much larger scale intervention. But there is a lot of similarities as well. Chomsky says, maybe contrary to what the popular history is on the Vietnam War, that the goal of the war was to stop communism from spreading, specifically because the party in charge had refused foreign investment. And obviously, the investors in the US would not have wanted this to happen. So, in the absence of being able to control the local military, like in a normal scenario, the US actually had to put troops on the ground, sacrifice its own men. We know a lot about the dark, bloody history of the Vietnam War. The US also apparently stopped many peace talks before entering the Vietnam War because of, I guess, a tendency towards violence in the regime. But Chomsky ultimately states, which is very interesting, that the US's main goal in the war was actually achieved because Vietnam was essentially completely destroyed, and we made sure after the war to keep it that way. Finally, in terms of specific wars that Chomsky discusses, he discusses the Gulf War and specifically our flip on Saddam Hussein as a country. So the US was allies with Saddam in certain pieces of the past before the Gulf War. Even not too far before the Gulf War, the American media had been pretty positive on Saddam Hussein, and there was just this sudden flip when it was convenient to flip. And so a lot of what Chomsky is pointing out here is about the American media, but then also about the state of our country to prefer war to peace in many areas, as also, like in Vietnam, the US refused peace talks and more peaceful solutions to the scenario, as they felt that the best way was to flex their military muscle. Chomsky brings the focus back to the US, where he talks about the tactics that the US media uses for propaganda. And he talks specifically about two tactics, and they're kind of used chronologically. So, first, we started off with Cold War propaganda that was very us versus them, evil enemy in the Soviet Union focused. But that sort of line is not as effective with the fall of the Soviet Union. And now Chomsky describes the landscape shifting from Cold War propaganda to the war on drugs propaganda, which has been used to be the excuse or the reasoning behind many interventions, especially in Central American and South American countries. According to Chomsky, it's clear that power in the US lies in investment, many of which who control investment are government officials. In order to bring about positive change, he encourages US citizens to do their own research and to not be compliant. He ends by reasserting that there is a struggle for freedom both at home and in the third world, and that people at home should strive for internal disruption that will help the plight of both groups. Overall, I give this book 5 stars and 90 out of 100. I found it to be well reasoned with good evidence to support Chomsky's claims. And I agree with Chomsky's general assessment that the US pursues foreign policies that only serve to benefit a select group of individuals within the nation. However, I also think that Chomsky is a bit too binary in some of his thinking, and that he writes from this very class conscious perspective of the managers versus the laborers, first world versus third world. And I do actually think that there is some legitimacy to both of those dynamics. However, I don't think it is, as Chomsky suggests, that suppression of the third world is always the reason for US foreign policy interventions. And I loved that Chomsky's writing also prompted some independent observations of my own, aside from what he's specifically written in the text. one of the things he talks about extensively in this text is the bias of the media and its support for US foreign interventions. And he talks about the alternative media as well, and that being an option for the people to kind of control the media a little bit more. But the prospects seem pretty grim to him as he is writing from the 90s and there's not as much avenues available for people to get their stuff out there as there are today. So I think that that's a really good thing about today's day and age is that the opportunity for independent media is wide open and it's actually become the norm rather than the mainstream media. I also noticed that many of the countries that the US has intervened in, specifically in Latin America, and caused political instability, violence, and economic challenges in these countries. These are countries where we faced massive amounts of immigration from these countries, for good or for bad. There's a lot of debates about it, right? And I don't think it's completely bad. But there are challenges that come with it, and these challenges are oftentimes created or at least partially created by our own interventions in these countries. Here is a copy of the book that I got. It's a collection of Chomsky's works. Just wanted to show that to you in case any of you were considering purchasing it as well. I think Chomsky's works and ideas are really worth chewing on. If you enjoyed this version of the Reading Corner, please hit the like to support and subscribe for more similar content. See you next time on the Reading Corner.